Welcome to Reimagining Anti-Violence Work, a small space where we're going to unpack the big issues currently impacting the anti-violence field and collectively dream up a new future. Hello, anti-violence workers, leaders, and anyone else that's made their way here. I'm your host, Steph, a former anti-violence worker and a member of the We Deserve Better project. Today, I'm joined by Rita Flores. Rita is a survivor, leader, facilitator, and consultant with over 25 years in the movement to end gender-based violence. Her work focuses on healing-centered strategy and building collaborative spaces. Rita joined the We Deserve Better project in 2025. Rita, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to talk to you about your experience in the field and ultimately what let you know that it was time to go.
Thanks, Steph. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to be here.
So, before we get started on knowing that it's time to leave, how did you first get involved in anti-violence work?
Yeah, started when I was 19. I started as a volunteer peer support facilitator for support groups for other young women like myself who had experienced child sexual abuse. I didn't get into that experience thinking that it would become a professional career. I didn't even consider this part of like movement work. It was simply I was 19 years old, going to school, and was starting to really, I had left home to go to school, and that distance from home got me really reflecting on my upbringing and my personal experiences. And so I was looking for a way to connect with other individuals who had experienced CSA. And I was trying to understand it, and I was trying to get out of that space where it felt like I was broken, that I was living with shame. And that support group, I took the volunteer training through the local program in Houston, and it was incredible. I was very much a young person, but I was every weekend doing support groups with other, young women who were like 16, 17, 18 years old, who were just now beginning to talk about their experiences. And it was difficult, but incredible. And from that, I just kept going. I saw what connection can do for people. And I just wanted to continue to do that and just kept doing it, throughout my life so far.
Yeah, Rita, thank you so much for sharing that. First of all, anytime a survivor is brave enough to share, especially on a recorded podcast like this about their experiences, it's really a privilege to hear that. And also, thank you for sharing because I think it is a reminder to all of our listeners about that connection between survivors and advocates, right? And that many of those working in the field do have their own experiences of abuse and really translate that into from healing to volunteering to advocacy. And you're certainly not the first individual I've met that has taken that journey. And you certainly won't be the last, but I think it's really important to recognize that you are one of many of the folks working in this field that are also navigating what it means to live a full, successful life after trauma and abuse.
Yeah, 100%. There was a period of time where after that, right, I went on and did direct service. I've kind of done every job you can imagine, everything from legal accompaniment to case management, all the things, right? And I just kind of saw myself just continuing to move in the work, and carry different roles. And I always saw myself as someone who had experienced abuse and had this form of trauma that was similar to the individuals that I was working with, but I often kept it to myself. I think especially as I grew in this work, I started to notice that, it wasn't necessarily safe to talk about your experiences, as a survivor. I think there was a lot of messages that made me question my legitimacy, in the field, that if I wasn't healed enough or I wasn't considered necessarily professional. And so I went through a long period of my time in the movement where I didn't talk about it. I certainly, didn't talk about it with the survivors that I was working with. If they asked me, for example, if had I experienced it or if I knew someone, I always answered affirmatively, yes, 100%. Like I felt like that was important to share. But in professional spaces, I didn't talk about it because it was clear that, there was this idea that like you couldn't be a professional if you were also a survivor, like your legitimacy was questioned, your professionalism was questioned. And even today, you see a lot of programs that are like, you can't receive services or you can't be employed unless there's been some time. But like, like I will always be healing from the experiences that I had. I'm
Yeah.
52 years old now, right? And many days I do reflect on the things that I experienced. And so I know for myself that I'm always going to be healing. And I've since have become more open about sharing my personal experiences because I refuse to be silenced. I refuse to be told that like I'm a less professional, I'm less credible as an advocate unless I'm healed. I think that creates a lot of harm for people like myself that are doing this work. And so I've kind of worked through it to feel comfortable and safe to talk about my experiences as a survivor.
Rita, thank you so much for sharing that because I also am certain that you're not alone in that experience of feeling like you're not able to be held in a lens of professionalism and also that of a survivor kind of in the same space. And I will confess that in the many years that I worked as the educator and trainer for my organization, bringing on volunteers, when I started, there was a rule kind of like this person had to be out of services for X amount of time in order to be able to volunteer. And I started, not in a way that is focused solely on removing that completely, but really kind of like, well, there is no timeline, right? And someone that has, been out of services for 1 month might really be able and capable of and amazing at doing this work. And someone that is, out of their abuse for 12 years, it might not be the right fit. And really looking at like there are people that don't have that abuse experience that it's not the right fit for, right? That we know this work isn't for everybody. And I think that's kind of screening out based on just the lived experience really does the mission a disservice, not just in the way it harms individuals like you, where you either have to kind of keep your survivorship hidden or feel like it impacts the way that you're viewed professionally, but also because I firmly believe that people that have lived experience provide a different and really powerful understanding to the work that you can't achieve without that. And so, you know, I think it is an honor for you to be so brave and share on this podcast for so many reasons. But I think one of the most important is that idea of saying to other survivor advocates, it doesn't make you less than. And actually it can give you an edge, right? As we're all kind of navigating that healing journey and the ways that we can be a support to folks that are have lived experience as they're navigating this work, right? To, think about like wraparound services. If you have a client that's coming in that has additional needs, you're not like, oh, they can't come in because they have those additional needs. It's how can we look at what those additional needs are and be supportive, right? So instead of screening out advocates that have that experience to really say, and this is kind of by the time I left my organization where we were with volunteers is how can I help you navigate this intro into this work, knowing that you have that lived experience? And what support do you need? And how can your supervisor be an additional support to you in kind of making this transition? How will we know if you are shutting down and maybe feel too overwhelmed to ask for support? Are there any indicators that we can look for, right? And so this idea of what we would do with any client, right? Before we started recording, we were talking about the parallel process for all of this, but the same way that we would figure out a way to be supportive for a client, how can we be supportive for our advocates? Kind of knowing that they really do have something special to offer the field.
It's funny because essentially what you're describing is trauma-informed care, right?
Right.
Like that's you,
Yeah.
that's trauma-informed care, right? And what I've seen is that organizations oftentimes struggle to do that internally, or
Yeah.
maybe, separate that, right? Thinking that, well, the trauma-informed approach is reserved for survivors externally, whereas it's an approach that should be, threaded through everything you do. It's something that you certainly wanted to make sure it's a standard for the participants you serve, but also for your staff. And
Yeah.
then and not solely for, the individuals that have experienced gender-based violence. It's also for the other multiple forms of trauma that many of us experience, right? Like, and so I think that's was most challenging in my position and the role that I left was that, I felt like I was oftentimes, trying to make that claim and trying to convince the other organizational leaders that we've missed it, that
Mm-hmm.
we missed that creating that standard internally, and it was very difficult and for people to see that, and I experienced a lot of resistance. And to me, it's wild that we would not consider making that the standard for everyone, internally, externally, because I believe if you aren't doing it, then I really question the level of trauma-informed care that you're providing externally. Like if you can't see that as something that needs to be the standard across, right, then I really question how well and how effective you are at doing that with, the people that you serve or the
Right.
community.
Yeah, Rita, that's literally exactly kind of what came to my mind as you were talking is that it trickles down from the top. So, is it possible to treat others in a trauma-informed way when you're not being treated in a trauma-informed way? Sure, it's possible. It's also much, much harder versus when you're held in a trauma-informed way to be able to hold others in that same way, right? We know everything is top down. So, certainly, if you're a supervisor or in middle management, in some way you can act as a buffer, right? Just as in some ways advocates can act as a buffer to the clients, but it's much more difficult and in some cases may really even be impossible because, if I'm not, being treated in a trauma-informed way by my job and I have to go in when I'm dysregulated, when I'm not supported, now we're really looking at that impossibility of providing a trauma-informed service to the client, no matter how much I want to, deep down in my heart, I'm just not capable of that in the space that I'm in. So yeah, you're really right on that it makes so much sense and it seems obvious, but yeah, there are so many places and spaces that, and I think maybe our American culture and society of like, you got to go to work, you got to, this is your job, we're paying you, we're not here to hold your hand. That mentality goes into it. And also, right, it's not working. So how do we kind of do it differently?
Yeah, exactly. And I think in anything that I say, I want to make sure that I'm not speaking in absolutes because I think the way you described it, I 100% agree. And I think what happens though is that you create risk, right? And you create the potential for harm. If individuals are working at a capacity that is far greater than what they can manage, if we're not learning to articulate our needs or our needs are being dismissed or minimized, like all of these things create risk and the potential for harm. I don't think anybody gets into these roles or is part of this movement set out to create harm. I think it's the conditions that when they go unchecked, or unexamined, leads to the risk. And all of us want to do our best. All of us want to put survivors' needs first. And when we're working under strain and the risk gets higher, that creates this burden, that people sometimes have a hard time being able to process it. If you're working in an organization where you can't process these stressors, it begins to wear on you, and it creates a strain and creates stress. And I saw that so much in the last organization that I worked in, and I saw it in myself. And I spent a lot of, sleepless nights thinking through like, how do I do better? How do I work harder? Like, how do I fix this? And in addition to my job, right? And
Hmm.
all of that strain at some point becomes too much to bear. And for me, I personalized it. I thought like, okay, I'm just going to put my head down and do the work and work harder. I'm going to get up early and I'm going to check my email before I get to work. I'm going to stay a little later. I'm going to eat my lunch at my desk. All of these things that seem kind of like small, but over
Mhm.
time, it really, for me, it I became overwhelmed and stressed, and it just became really difficult, and I couldn't ignore it any longer.
Yeah. Kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back.
It was, and it took a coach. I worked with a coach. Shout out to Beatriz, who was phenomenal, for me to realize, I was stuck in a loop, and there were several red flags along the way. But this loop of I can fix it, I can do more, I can do better, that loop was I had to step out of it, and it took a coach to, reflect back to me what I was saying and what I was thinking, and for me to really see it and choose myself. I had started as a coordinator, kind of was promoted multiple times to eventually being a director and part of the organizational leadership. And so that sense of responsibility kind of grew greater, over the years. And I really cared about the people that I worked with. And so, yeah, I wanted to do better. I wanted to try harder. I wanted to fix things. I was constantly looking out like, why is this happening? Like somehow if I understood the why that I could, fix it. But yeah, it took a coach, reflecting those things to me for me to come to the realization that it's okay to choose myself, and that the sense of that it can feel, scary to leave but staying in the harm has a cost too. And so it took some time, but I eventually left. I left on good terms, but I resigned because I felt like, yeah, there's nothing I can do is going to change this culture alone, right? And
Yeah.
the toll that it was taking on me physically was not. I didn't want to sacrifice my health for a role or an organization that to me was not taking the steps to change.
Yeah, Rita, thank you for sharing that. When you were talking, it reminded me again, I think every episode I say this, but it really reminded me of exactly what we hear from DV survivors about if I just work harder, if I can just, do this right, put in more energy, it can fix things. And that the toll that that takes, it can become untenable. And so I think I am certain that you're not alone when we think about our listeners out there. And it can be really challenging to decide that an organization that you love is not right for you anymore. I know because I've been there. How did you, once you realized, okay, it's time to go, thankfully had someone reflecting it back to you, which I think is important for all of us, right? That some hearing our own voice outside our heads. How did you decide what you wanted to do next?
Yeah, before I answer that, I kind of want to come back to something that wasn't really clear when I started coaching. And I also want to just say that like that is a privilege to be able to, hire a coach, someone that can walk you through things. I was grasping, my partner saw the toll that this job was having on me. And, for me was like, this is an investment, I don't have anybody to process this with and within my organization that's going to help me see things and make some decision points in my life. My partner, super supportive, but also was just, was more like, just quit, which, yeah, it makes so much sense. But I needed to untangle myself from how much this job meant to me. And that simply
Mhm.
couldn't be resolved with the just quit, right? And so, but going to and talking to a coach is a privilege. But yeah, before I get back to answer that question, I something that also that I just heard myself say, but also came to me later was that I personalized what I was experiencing, right? Like it was all about me to fix it, and it clearly was having a direct impact on my emotional and physical health. You were talking about, how this is similar to other survivors' experiences, right? What I didn't mention was that there were some very clear tactics or things that were happening, and so it was those things that I minimized, right? I chalked them up to being part of the organizational culture of
Mm.
excellence, right? Like there was this, we used that we were experts all the time. We referenced ourselves as experts in this movement, experts on this topic. And so a lot of the flags, that were happening and the behaviors that were happening, I felt like, well, this organization does a lot of work, we're influential. So that's why I personalize it because I felt like, okay, I just got to work harder to meet this expectation. But there were things that were happening that, I experienced that weren't me, right? I felt like I had to fix it, but they weren't, they were being done to me. And so those are the things that I think for others, out there listening, you may experience things. But for me, I wish I wouldn't have downplayed them. I wish I would have kind of looked at them as a whole and saw this as like this is a toxic environment. So some of those things were before I became a director, I was a manager, but I was often stuck in the middle between the executive director and my direct supervisor, who was another director. And I was my director's confidant, who our supervision was less about my programming and talking through the things that I was working on, but was more a space for me to listen to her stressors. I remember that, I would be driving to work, and I would get a phone call from my supervisor. And the whole drive to work, I live about 45 minutes to an hour from my job. I would listen to her talk about the issues that she was experiencing. So essentially, she was dumping on me
Right.
every morning. And that's how I started my day. And eventually I got to the point where I would like try to not, I would just not answer the call, because I knew like, oh, I'm going to get stuck in this call, and that's
Yeah.
going to be the start of my day, that I'm already going to feel stressed about the day and I haven't even got there. And it wasn't even my experiences, right? Like I wanted to be supportive for them, but at the same time, I didn't have any positional authority or any influence to change their experiences. And so I had to listen to that, most mornings. Then I would get, this is what's happening. And so I was stuck in this triangulation between two people that had far more positional authority than I had. And so I think that's what influenced this idea of like, try harder. If I try harder, I can make
Right.
things better for our department. I remember one time my supervisor asked me about an individual who many in the organization felt was creating harm. And I shared very openly my perspective. And I foolishly thought, like this was a conversation between the two of us. And the next day, I'm walking to the kitchen and I get pulled into the executive director's office. And she immediately questioned me about the things that I had said to my supervisor. And, I shared with her, I was like, this is my perspective. I'm not speaking for other people in the organization. She asked, I answered. This is my experience and my perspective. And essentially, I was just told to, that my perspective didn't matter, and that
Wow.
what I, observed or what I experienced was, unimportant. And so that was, like that was the beginnings of like me learning that you can't speak out. If you speak out, you're going to be met with that kind of response, right? And so it just kind of like, oh, I walked away going, shit, now I'm now on notice, right? That
Mm.
I said what I said, and now I'm going to be on the shit list, right? And the shit list rotated. It depends on who that week or that day was going to be on it. But, so like it's those kind of things that happen, that really got me to understand the culture that I was working on. That didn't, prevent me from speaking my mind or talking about things that I observed or speaking up, but it created a stress that I knew that like, well, if I am going to speak, get prepared to be ignored in meetings, get prepared to be the silent treatment, and so it came at with risk. And so I think those are just a few examples, but like how like that culture and those behaviors force you into this sense of like, let me work harder, let me put my head down, let me, push through. And over time, that's where, I experienced that just overwhelming stress.
Yeah.
And some days were good, right? Some days we had like you described earlier, the survivor's experience. not all experiences were negative or bad. There
Right.
were some experiences that I'm like, there's so many brilliant people that work there that I care for, that I love, and that, so it didn't negate those, but there clearly was, this was a toxic environment that if you wanted to work there, if you wanted to continue to have those relationships, you had to figure out a way to push through all of these behaviors in order to stay. And for me, I maxed out at 7 years.
Yeah. Thank you for kind of digging back in and sharing more about what your experiences were and how that ultimately kind of let you know that it was time to go. Because I think some of these, they can almost feel like intangible, the qualities that make up that toxic work environment. And lack of boundaries, communication issues, triangulation. What started coming up for me is that those are all issues that we can see in like dysfunctional family of origins. And we know that a higher percentage of our workers are coming from homes where they had challenges in their family relations, right? Again, no absolutes, not all, but many of our advocates, right? Whether it's family of origin or lived experiences later in life, have lived those things. And so it kind of makes, again, like you're talking about with risk factors, it makes sense that we might see these things emerge. Then you add in other stressors. But I'm saying all this as kind of like, let's remove the shame from identifying that these things are happening within our organizations because these are learned behavior patterns. They can be unlearned. Sometimes people aren't even thinking about the fact that, the silent treatment causes harm. And we also know that it very much does, right? So I think what you described is exactly that toxic work environment that when accompanied with a person that internalizes, I'm going to work harder, I'm going to be more perfect, I'm going to do all those things, that creates this, cortisol spike in your system that is going to degrade your health in one way or another and kind of how it shows up, other than your loved ones saying, just quit. Because I think many of us, probably many folks that have left, many folks that are still there, have friends and family that are like, just quit. And we know that it's not that easy. Even when financially we can make it work, there's still that emotional tie to something that you love. And the challenge that brings up, again, that parallel to our clients, right? Leaving behind something that you love because that's the thing that's better for you is a different kind of grief, a different place to be.
Yeah, and something that I think that like I think it applies to all of us, right? Like even the organizational leaders, right? Like I don't want to minimize the experiences that they have, right? And the stress that they carry. I think what happens though in toxic environments is that when you have power, you get to choose whose stress you prioritize,
Mm,
right? So I think you can say the executive director or the other organizational leaders also have stress, also have capacity issues, also have experienced, are experiencing vicarious trauma, or right, like they are
mm,
not immune to these things either. Just because you get promoted into positions of leadership doesn't mean that, you don't also have these experiences. But what happens though is that you have power. And what I saw in my organization or that organization was that we got to prioritize those in power and their needs. So when
right.
they felt, the push back from staff around the toxic culture, they wanted to protect themselves. They wanted they were like, well, we're also stressed, we're also experiencing the stress of what's happening in our movement. And so everybody else, that was speaking out got, labeled as difficult, or disrespectful, right?
Right.
But what they were really asking for is some culture change so that all of us can benefit, right? But yeah, I think that's what's different, right? When it comes to organizational trauma is that organizational leaders have the power to influence the change, and they get to decide whose feelings or perspective is worthy, and if they're under strain, they're going to choose themselves if they're not working through this and processing this in a way that benefits everyone.
That is such an important point. And I was also thinking about not only do those leaders who absolutely are stressed and are getting pressure in other ways, not only do they have the power to choose whose stress matters and how to navigate that, many of them are also making six-figure wages, three times, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10 times what the average advocate is making. And I'm due for my annual physical, and I was just doing the like pre-appointment check-in. And there's a survey there now that asks about life stressors. And aren't they all financial? Every single one. Are you worried about paying about food, about your electrical bill? Has your rent been late and at all in the past year? Every single one of these factors that they're asking about, life stressors, can be related back to, do you have the financial means to care for yourself at this time? And so I think it must not be separated, because we also know from the We Deserve Better Project survey that advocates need to be paid more, and that's one of the major pieces. So when you take this pressure cooker of work stress and then you add in that the financial stressors that folks are also navigating, we have advocates in this country that need to utilize public assistance to make ends meet. And so when you're in that situation, it compounds that stress that you're feeling in the workplace. And I know, just for an example, when you talk about leaders have the power to choose whose stress matters, at my former organization, leadership gave themselves a raise during 2020 and didn't give other staff a raise.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And, I found that out years later, and I'm still makes my stomach turn a little bit, but I felt it needed to be said kind of in light of that point you just made, right? Is that leadership just, that implicit bias of like, my stress is so hard. I'm working so hard. It's so My job is so important. Everyone's gonna, most folks are gonna see it that way. Another thing that came up for me was that a lot of current leadership don't have that direct service experience. They might come from other fields, they might be from other places. And so that, to me, just kind of guessing, you don't have that direct understanding of what it feels like to be that advocate. And so to be able to empathize with that as you're prioritizing whose stress matters more, it's really challenging to incorporate that lens in if you haven't had that experience or don't already seek to connect with those voices to get an understanding of what it is, right? Because you don't have to have an experience. You can also really learn from people that have, if you're willing to listen, right? And really take it in. So everything's so interconnected, but all those pieces were coming up for me as you were sharing, about that stress and the way that it hits differently for leadership.
Yeah, yeah. And it's reinforced, and what I observed and experienced, though, it's also reinforced by the board. right? And our board was comprised of other local organizations, DBSA organizations. And so, this idea that, the staff should feel grateful for their positions,
Uh-huh.
and in our case, working at a coalition, um, we're privileged, to have those roles, right? And so, and that was reinforced, you know, by the board, like we have to at all costs protect the organizational leaders of this organization, and so, yeah, that it just creates a harmful way to consider running and leading or a DBSA organization, or any organization, that when you're thinking of like your staff or your employees, is like, you should be grateful for where you're at. Like that's already, setting up a really harmful relationship with the people that you employ. We went through 5 different consultants that were, retained to address our organizational culture. So the board knew, everybody, like this was no secret. Like we hired 5 different consultants over a period of time, and each consultant raised the same issues, and we didn't see the culture change, and so it's like there were so many different feelings that I experienced there, from just sadness to where it's like we can't address this, and it's hard.
Yeah.
Myself and others, we saw good people leave. Yeah, and also just anger and frustration that like we are telling you what our experiences are, and we're not really setting the conditions to change. And yeah, I like hearing myself, and when I talk about this experience, I'm always like, come on, like all the signs were there. Why did you stay so long?
Mm.
And yeah, I loved what I was doing. I loved the people that I worked with, and yeah, I thought we're gonna get there, until, it just wasn't clear that we weren't going to get there, or at least not in a time that, felt worthy of me continuing to sacrifice my emotional and physical health, and so, yeah, I chose, through my coaches, support, I chose myself, and I had a lot of, regret about it initially, but I'm so glad that I did.
Yeah. Rita, I'm so glad that you chose yourself also. And I think also, how could you not see it? Because that's how our brains work, right? That's how this type of violence continues to go on in our society. Because the people with power have the power to create the narrative, to create the, change or not change that needs to happen. And so this is, really replicates things that go on in society all around us, right? That people in power and hierarchy, not only do you tangibly have more power, but your voice is respected more. Your have the opportunity to sometimes gatekeep. I know, my agency also did the consultant thing, and the board was informed of the results, but staff were never really allowed to speak to the board. There was no avenue of communication between staff and the board. And so it was really always the information that went to the board was gate kept by leadership. And I think that is probably really common across spaces. And I think speaks to when you just look at hierarchy, it's like, oh, well, that's the natural flow of information. That's that's our subordinate. They report to us. And also that's part of the problem, right? Is um, that there are too many opportunities for the people empowered to kind of influence that and take advantage of people like you that love that organization, that have this internalized drive to work harder when the going gets tough, that um, believe in change and the power of that, right? Can and the mission that can all be kind of extorted in that system. And so I think how you don't see it is because that's the design, right, of the whole process. And for me, it's more like, thank goodness you did and you were able to get out, because there's so many, I think, others that either haven't or can't kind of navigate through that.
Yeah, and I feel like I said, I think their flags were there. It was obvious. There was cultural issues, and I think it was, feeling like, yeah, the hope that it would improve,
Right.
minimizing the experiences, and then coupled with, enjoying being there,
Yeah.
loving the work, loving the people, not thinking that I would have a similar experience if I left. So yeah, all of those things combined, it was like, yeah, I knew it, my spidey senses were telling me like danger, like I knew, what was happening. But yeah, yeah, I'm a resilient individual. I've worked through hard, difficult things in my life. I know how to push through, and took people around me to go, yeah, like when is enough, you know? And yeah, I had reached the point where it was like, yeah, it's been enough, this is not mine to fix. And if I was capable of fixing it or addressing it or making it better, I could have done it already, right? And
Right. 7 times.
7 times, yeah, like so, and yeah, processing that, it was different because I wasn't, we would talk about it, everybody talked about it. And I had friends that didn't work there, but also part of the movement that we talked about it, so it was like it was open in a way that the issues were glaring, right? But yeah, talking to someone like Beatrice was really helpful because it was like a mirror. It was processing things that I said and have someone question it for me. That was different, right? And I also started to join other spaces outside of coaching once that wrapped up. I would go to Talk It Out, and hear other people's experiences. There was another one that the leadership learning community offers for BIPOC individuals. And so I was going to these different spaces, and it was like, ah, I see what's happening here. And that also gave me a place to process it differently than the way that I was processing it within the organization that I worked, right? Because it was so direct, these were my peers that I was working with, and so, but talking to it in external spaces kind of helped also really kind of get clear on my attachment to this organization, my identity with this movement. And it was once I started to kind of make sense and process those aspects that it was like, yeah, there something will come of my place in the movement if I leave this organization. And those spaces gave me the reassurance for that.
Yeah. I think that that is probably really relatable for a lot of our listeners, of this idea that really does take talking to someone outside that space to help get the clarity, because everyone at that organization is also, I guess, for lack of a better term, like drinking the Kool-Aid. And so,
Yep.
so to have someone to be able to reflect back, you said, is, it is a privilege, and also, one that is really worth it. It reminds me of a conversation on a different episode where we talked about kind of the things that we can do to pour into ourselves and how those are never wasted. And so I kind of think of coaching as one of those things that really every dollar spent is a dollar that forever improves your ability to value yourself and others' ability to value you as well.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there was a lot, and I think, again, this is really relatable for our viewers, a lot that kind of came to this decision of like, okay, I got to get out of here. This isn't healthy for me. It's not going to change. Um, no matter when someone decides that it's time to go, right? It's going to be different points for everybody. No one else can decide for you. But how did you decide what to do next with your career? Because it sounds like from what you were saying, when you made that determination that it was time to go, it was kind of a little bit open. Like I will find something in this field, but it wasn't really kind of locked in or secure.
Yeah, it kind of happened in a funny way. I was hanging out at the river with another member of Collective Capacity. Hadn't joined that, but it was somebody that I worked with in the past, and we were just chilling in the river, hanging out. And I think I said something like, "I think I'm done. I've had enough." And she casually said, "Okay, come join us." And I was like, "Really?" And she was like, "Yeah, everybody would be happy to have you come join us at Collective Capacity." Collective Capacity is a consulting firm that was created by two other anti-violence workers or advocates. And so, and the funny thing is, I didn't even think of that as a place for me, right? Like I knew what they were doing. But yeah, I didn't see that as a place for me. And so we hung out at the river. And then later, that night I texted her, I think, and I was like, "For real?" And she's like, "For real." And so I was like, "Okay, that's it." And so, I had no clue what it would take for me to be a consultant or how to set it up, but I trusted this individual, and I wasn't 100% trusting myself that it was going to work, but I saw it as like an opportunity. And so I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And, went back to my job already kind of thinking of my exit plan. Like, what do I need to do to prepare to leave that job? Because it was important for me to leave, with care, and then simultaneously also think about like, okay, what do I need to do financially to make this shift? What do I need to work from home as a consultant? Oh, I got to buy my own laptop, like all these kind of things that like,
Yeah.
okay. And so I just started it gave me something to really kind of wrap my head around in terms of like making a plan. And if anybody knows me, they know I'm a planner, and I created a plan for myself, and that it was scary, but it also gave my brain something to focus on. And so everything in those last few months were really focused on making that shift. And yeah, I was scared. I was insecure about like, am I going to get contracts? Who's going to want to work with me? What do I have to offer? But I trusted, my friend and now my colleague, and I trusted the others, and they did. Once I made that shift, they introduced me to their partners, and so or invited me into to subcontract with them. And so as day one, I had a project waiting for me, and then it just continued over time. I think this year is my fourth year as a consultant, and I know that may not be something that's available to everyone, but it worked for me in terms of my needs. And honestly, I don't see myself doing anything differently in the near future or I'm happy at what I'm doing. I have a sense of balance in my life that I haven't had in a long time. And I'm working with, other partners and organizations that are so values aligned and connected. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I didn't see this to be possible. And it is and has been, and it's been incredible for me. But yeah, it all started just casually sitting in the water with a friend of mine going, I've had enough,
Yeah.
and having friends and that are there to support me along the way.
Yeah, we can't stop talking about the parallels, but this idea of not trusting yourself, I really, really relate to that. And just kind of when you've dug in so hard to try to fix something that's broken and you kind of, are living in that stress and you do really lose yourself a little bit. And the realization that it's not going to work kind of chips away at your feeling like you can trust yourself. And so I think I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think there are probably a lot of folks that are in that space of like, well, how could I leave and what would it look like? And is this the right thing? And just like survivors of domestic and sexual violence, having that support system is really what makes the difference. And folks that you can trust to lean on and guide you in the right direction. I'm so glad that you had that and that it turned out to be such a great fit for you. And I think that that is kind of taking that leap is so scary. But also, like myself and many survivors, right? Like continued to work while you made that exit plan. And like just like DV survivors, you're living in that relationship while you're planning your exit. And so just again, just all these parallels that are coming up with how to really be able to leave successfully, right? Maybe not just quitting in the heat of the moment as much as we might like to, but really using that to reach out to our networks and to get the support that we need and to make that. So whether it's as a consultant or anything else that we're doing after we leave, just that success in having really thought it through.
Yeah, I feel like I have the benefit of distance now. It's been 4 years. But if you would have asked me in that first year, you would have heard me talk about my insecurity at length. I had a lot of insecurity, and that's wild to me, right? Like that's wild that someone that had been in the movement for so long, that had, you know, always been promoted through different roles, that clearly did well, right? Like that I left feeling insecure, right? Like that's wild to me. Like distance, I see that, but that first year, that's what I felt. I had this feeling like if I had stayed longer, maybe I could have improved things. But with distance, I've been able to see that as like I wasn't a failure. I actually made a decision that was best for myself, was best for my family, and allowed me to stay true to my values and allowed me to, in many ways, I feel like I'm that 19-year-old peer support facilitator again. Like I've been able to kind of come back to that why I sought out to be in this movement in the first place. And so, but it took me time, those first couple of years were difficult. I had a lot of resentment and frustration. I had to unfollow, that organization because it was very difficult for me to see their, and this, I feel like this sounds shady, but like it was very difficult for me to see their social media posts, and for them to be praised for their work when I knew that like myself and so many others had experienced harm. And so it's just kind of like, it's kind of like that, like everybody there knows, but no one externally may know. And if they do, they're choosing to look the other way. And so seeing that was just kind of a reminder. And so I stopped following them, because it was like I need to remove myself from the things that will activate me, and that was one of them. But distance has created more space for me to interpret that experience differently. I'm not a failure. I chose myself and the type of work that I want to do in the conditions that I want to work, and I've realized that like it is possible. And yeah, I'm grateful that now I can look at it with some distance and be in a different place. But those first few years were difficult. I was stressed about money. I thought like, I don't know if I'll find another role similar, would other people hire me, like all of those things. And so, yeah, those first few years were really difficult. But I'm, yeah, grateful in the place that I am now.
Yeah, it definitely takes time to rebuild what gets lost in those toxic systems. But thank you so much for sharing that because I know I'm still navigating a little bit of that insecurity, even just 2 years out, and I would imagine that there are many others that feel that same way because I think when you're in that kind of system, whether you're internalizing the blame or outwardly being blamed, it takes a toll, even when we know what's happening and are able to kind of tell ourselves that it's not true. It definitely takes a toll. And I remember really very much towards the end doing the 40-hour domestic violence training, which I had trained hundreds of times, so many times I'd done this training. And I just remember, I think I even said to my supervisor at that time, I just feel like I can't even do the basic job duties of my job anymore. I don't know what's happening. And so it's really hard to have that lived experience, impacting your functioning, the trauma impacting, how you show up and keep a positive self-image of yourself as an employee and a professional, and all the capacities, which we know serves as a barrier to being able to leave, right? It's just if I don't feel great about myself, then how am I going to feel like I'm going to be really successful creating my own income and kind of making ends meet without this organization? And so I certainly kind of also share that anxiety of like the financial stressors and all these different pieces that are coming up. But again, that the idea of being values aligned. When you said the collective capacity, kind of sharing in your experience there about being values aligned, I think it's really priceless. And I think that that is what so many workers would be, happy to navigate some other experiences if their organization was values aligned and really kind of operating in that way. Other than that, any other differences in your experience in working as a consultant versus working for a specific organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's many. It's collaborative. Um, where all of us kind of operate under the LLC, and now there's primarily just two of us. The others have gone on and pursued other things. But yeah, I mean, sometimes we work projects together, but oftentimes we're working our projects independently. But when we do work together, it's a collaboration. We're working from our strengths. We're not tied to like a particular role or position. We're just really working from what we're most passionate about, and or things that we do well, we spend a lot of time also taking care of each other and taking care of each other's needs. Like let's say if we're working together, spend some time, processing, like, where are you at? Like, where's your heart? What do you need? And like really mean it. Like, we're not asking those questions of each other just so that we can kind of push through our agenda. Like, we're genuinely sitting with those responses and adjusting our work based on that. And our work is still turns out well, right? But we're doing it with a lot of love and care along the way. And what that means for me is that when I close my laptop at the end of the day, I can separate myself and walk away with ease, and in my heart and mind, like, yeah, we did a great thing today. I can now go about my day and not feel stressed, about like work that's pending. When we have difficulties, we name it. Hey, you fell short in this way. Like, what do we need to do differently? What do I need to take off your plate? How can I support you? Like, we're just talking through it, and it's yeah, like I don't see how any organization couldn't operate from that way. I do think that all our organizations could have those same standards, but I think you would have to really be willing to separate yourself a bit from the role and the power that you have, and really address those dynamics of how power influences the relationship. And if you can do that, I think you really could start to create these same conditions that I have now at any organization. But if you're seeing yourself, and not even maybe like, so directly, but if you're imagining, like, I earn this role as a director, or as an executive director, I'm entitled to X, Y, and Z, then I think that's going to show up in the relationship that you have with other individuals, and it's going to set the conditions for that culture. And we're very deliberate, in our relationship, that we're going to support each other in doing this work, because we want to be a part of the gender-based violence movement, right? Like, we want to be influencing culture change and addressing the conditions that allow violence to continue. And we see that starts within the way that we care for each other and our work, and so, yeah, we're just very deliberate about it. And I think that's what's made us successful in our relationships with our partners, because we're clear about that's what we're doing for each other, and hence that's what we're going to do with the people that we work with. And yeah, I want that for everyone, and I do believe that it's possible, but it would require us to really kind of examine our relationship with power and how that's been commodified within the anti-violence movement.
Mm. What you said is so rich, and I think something that I think about as a middle class white woman, middle-aged middle class white woman, I often think about when I'm facilitating a classroom, any space I'm in, where do I hold power? Where this person might have experienced marginalization, or where they don't hold power. And what do I need to do in this interaction to make sure that I'm not holding that power over this person? And it's not always easy, right? But it is always worth it and valuable. And I think so yeah, when you said that about leadership kind of looking at their own relationship with power and how they can really mitigate that within their relationships with staff, just really hit home for me, because you know we get a lot of response of like, well, we need the hierarchy, we need people to have different power roles within an organization for it to function. And Whether or not I believe that to be true is a whole other podcast. But what you just said, right? If you are going to have a hierarchical structure, how do those people that are at a higher level of that structure operate in power with instead of power over? And you're right, I also very much believe that it's possible for anyone that's willing to do the work and the internal healing and all that stuff that's required. But yeah, I certainly, transparency, communication, humility in kind of like I got this wrong and I'd love to hear from you how I can do it better from your perspective. Those things are all attainable for all of us and and yet sometimes feel so far away.
Yeah, but they're also the principles that we just that are described in trauma-informed care. Like,
Correct.
like those are that's what's, like, and again, like it's a practice, right? Like
Right,
even within my current, situation, like, yeah, we don't get it right all the time, like it's a process. But yeah, again, here we are describing trauma-informed care again, right? And
yeah, can't stop, won't stop talking about
yeah,
trauma-informed
and
care.
so yeah, yeah, I'll say that like I sometimes think like I'm happy about the contribution that I can make now. And I worry about the ability for this movement to address the current needs and the future needs because it feels like if we can't care for the people in this moment, how are we going to continue to be able to address the issues that are currently happening or will continue to happen? Like we need to be fortified, right? And not all organizations, but some organizations are not fortified for this moment,
Right,
and it's draining advocates. It's draining the individuals that allow this movement to continue. And that's like I was telling you earlier, I was nervous about doing this podcast. At first, I was kind of like, when you asked me, I was like, yeah, of course. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And then as it kind of sunk in, I started to get nervous because I was like, oh, how do what I'm going to say make sense? Is it going to come out right? I had the sense of like, I'm telling secrets, and that started to create a little bit of worry, right? Um, you reassured me. And also just like what I realized is that I got have a choice in what I'm going to share, and how I want to share it. And, it may not come out totally succinct or clear or polished, but that's okay because I want other individuals who maybe experience something similarly to know that there's something out there for you and that you're not alone in this experience. And also, as a wake-up call that like we need to care for the people that are doing this work. If not, like I worry about us being able to meet the challenges that we're currently under and will continue to experience because we're making it really hard for the individuals to do this work. And that really matters to me more than anything is that, we are taking care of each other in this moment and beyond.
yeah, it's beyond just, we all share this same trauma. It's really that we owe it to ourselves and each other and the movement to really, you know, I I believe, like you said, everyone in this movement really cares about it. And also, a lot of those same people are still, perpetuating harms within the system. And how do we kind of reconcile that and take away these barriers to acting on it and to acknowledging, right, that it's okay if you happen to be a part of the system that's perpetuating these harms, because probably all of us have done it at one point. And in the same vein, we're never going to save the planet if we're not doing recycling in our own home kitchen.
Mhm.
It's like you talked about kind of the way that you operate at collectively caring. I'm sorry, collective capacity, and the way that that relationship, I don't think you specifically said it. I think I added it in my mind, but the way that you operate in that space, kind of serving as a model for the places that you're working with, kind of like, this is how we operate. We we use these principles in our work with each other as like a model for those places. Like, look, it's functioning. We see how it's. Do you see it that way, or is that just something that I was kind of assigning to it as you were sharing?
I think that was you, but I'm gonna take it. Like, it sounds really nice and I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't think, I, I don't know if I considered it as modeling. The LLC was created by two other advocates to be a place as like a refuge for other advocates that wanted to continue to stay in the movement, but do the work differently. And so that was the initial idea. And then Jessica and I have continued to kind of carry that thread forward. And yeah, I don't think it was an intention to model necessarily, but it was a place that we can find that we can do the work the way we want to do it, and
Mm,
conditions that we wanted to nurture, and a way to keep us here, like keep us involved in the movement, and to take care of ourselves, right? And take care of each other. And so if that can be a model for others, that's incredible. But yeah, I think it was just simply, people wanting to stay in the movement, but stay within the movement under conditions that, allowed us to thrive,
yeah.
and yeah, and that's what it's been. And I'll have to say, like, when I first started consulting, I had to kind of work through some of those that, oh, I got to do it, timely. I got like that grind, that, perfectionism, like that still lived in me. And so I had to really undo some of that thinking, and way of approaching work. Like I was like, oh, I don't have to work like that anymore. Like, and I can actually pause in the middle of the day and go walk the dogs.
Mhm.
I can actually not check my email first thing in the morning. One of my favorite things to do is slow mornings with coffee outside. That is my morning ritual. And I was like, I don't have to skip that anymore, And so it's like, I often remind myself, like, I have to be careful that I don't recreate those conditions of oppression. I don't want to be my own oppressor, and so
Yeah.
I have practices that I work at, to protect myself from that, and also create something different. And I think that I do it for myself. Jessica has her own, and then collectively we try to support each other in that. And I think that's what's how we approach our work. And yeah, I appreciate that you see that as a model, but yeah, I don't think that was like the priority. It was more about like, how do we take care of each other as we continue to be involved in this movement. And I'm so grateful that, we have this space to do it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Whether or not it was intended, it certainly seems like a really powerful model to me. And I also, what I love about your story, Rita, and kind of share this in common with mine, is that the the reason for staying so long is a love for the mission, a love for the organization and for the work. And so finding another way to be a part of the movement without being at a specific anti-violence organization for me, and it sounds like for you, really helped with the grief of that transition and the feelings of loss. And I know you mentioned, right, your kind of connection of your identity to this work, and I also share that. And so, yeah, I think that's such a beautiful piece of your story is that you were able to find a way to continue igniting that passion and doing this work in a space that was healthy for you, that aligned with your values, and really is setting up to create kind of the change that we need for this work. So Rita, I could talk to you all day, and I think we already have maybe. But before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for anti-violence workers that are considering leaving their organization?
I struggle with like advice to anyone. I think that, everyone's situation is different. I think what I would say is simply for me, no job or no place in this movement is worth your health or peace of mind. I think that if we want to be able to, influence conditions, we have to take care of ourselves. And when it starts to impact the quality of your life, the way that you see yourself within this movement, then that's a time to kind of really take a closer look and see what changes you need to make, but I think everyone's situation is different in terms of the choices that they can make. But yeah, I think it's okay to know when it's time to walk away. Sometimes we may not feel like because we're supporting survivors in some capacity, whether directly or indirectly, we feel a sense of responsibility. But I remember Beatrice told me something like, but how is my sense of responsibility serving me?
Mm,
And that was, one of the ways that she helped me realize that like I have a sense of responsibility for everyone and everything, but I'm not turning that same sense of responsibility to my own well-being. And, slowly she chipped away on the resistance and got me to understand that. And it's things that we know, right? Like we all know this. Like I hear myself talking to you. I hear what you're saying. It's like we know this,
yeah.
and when it becomes personal or it becomes direct, we find different ways of, processing it. But yeah, at the end of the day, our well-being is incredibly important, and choose yourself.
Yeah. Rita, I have such a parallel experience of when I did that brain states awareness profile, and the consultant said to me, well, if you could just consider yourself as much as you consider everybody else. And that's what just came up as you were saying that, because it's the common problem of the people pleaser, or perhaps the common problem of an advocate is kind of putting others above ourselves. And you're right, you only get one you, and you can't be valuable to the mission if you're not functioning yourself. So I know you don't like to give advice, but those are some pretty great words to leave our viewers with. Rita, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your story, how you knew it was time to leave your organization, and where your journey has taken you since. Hopefully, all of you out there learned something, were validated in your experiences, or inspired to find a new path that's right for you. If you or someone you know is interested in joining the We Deserve Better project or in being a guest on the podcast, check out the show notes for details on how to connect. Thanks for listening. Remember, anti violence work is neither anti violent nor working to end violence. So keep talking and reimagining amongst yourselves.